As many listeners to this show know, I owe my life as a journalist to Amy Goodman, the host of Democracy Now! I like to say that her show was my university, and it was where I learned the trade of journalism. Amy Goodman is one of the finest journalists this country has ever produced.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
With the Trump administration attempting to drive the U.S. into war against Iran, it's impossible to ignore the historical record of how the U.S. lies its way into war, the role of powerful corporate journalists in those campaigns, and the lessons that we all must embrace if we want to stop this insanity.
There is a reason why our profession is the only one explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on government, essential to the functioning of a democratic society. We all became so familiar with those images on the front pages of newspapers and all of the networks, and I'm not just talking about Fox. All of the networks that continually showed us that bullseye on the forehead of Saddam Hussein. That is not the most accurate image of what happens in war. It would have been more accurate to show that bullseye on the forehead of a little Iraqi girl, because that's who dies in war.
I also wanted to talk to Amy and get her to share some stories of her early reporting and how she came to be the journalist she is today, hosting the most important daily independent radio and TV program in this country. Amy Goodman joins me now. Amy, thanks for coming back on Intercepted.
It's great to be with you, Jeremy.
So the latest news out of Iran, it really does seem like there's a major push to go to war against Iran. How do you see this current situation and what we all lived through and reported on in 2003 and the buildup to the invasion and occupation of Iraq?
I mean, it's horrifying, and the deja vu element of this is so serious. It's absolutely critical people understand the history. I mean, the key players involved talk about how they were misled. You have Secretary of State Colin Powell, right, who gives this speech February 5th, 2003.
The purpose of this meeting is to hear a presentation by the United States. I call now on the distinguished Secretary of State of the United States of America, His Excellency, Mr. Colin Powell.
Thank you, Mr. President.
He had a lot of credibility because he was dragging his feet on war. And so President Bush, Vice President Cheney wanted him to be the deliverer of the final message. So he goes and gives his speech at the United Nations.
My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
And says he's convinced by the evidence. He's showing video and photos of mobile WMD units. He is holding up a vial of something. And in the end, since so many people were convinced by this, because this was the person who was wary of going to war, he said this was a blot on his career. It's like the worst mistake he had made.
Some of the information I presented, which was multi-source, was wrong. And it is a blot on my record. But, there's nothing I can do to change that blot.
He presented these images, and we move forward to today. And what do we see? These undefined, fuzzy images. This is the rock-solid evidence that Iran is interfering with commerce in the Gulf of Oman. It is absolutely incumbent on every journalist and on everyone to question what is being presented. And so they just keep on trying. But just the repetition every day, I think for the American people, it exhausts them. And it's, that repetition of the big lie. After a while, you think, well, there must be something to it, even if any one little bit of evidence isn't enough. I mean, this is a catastrophic situation. But as President Trump announces his reelection campaign, there's nothing he thinks, I believe, that draws a country more together and away from the issues he doesn't want us to pay attention to than a foreign adversary. And this has been going on for decades, and it's just being ramped up again.
You know, it's kind of fascinating to analyze the evolution or devolution, however you want to view it, of the way journalists and large news organizations handle these situations. Because you will have on any given day on cable news many, many Democrats, politicians, pundits, whatever a Democratic strategist is, and they're all talking about how we can't trust anything that the Trump administration says. And then you have, when it comes to, Israel policy or certain issues around Saudi Arabia or now Iran, where you have very prominent Democrats who claim to believe that Trump is the greatest threat ever to American democracy, who are actively promoting this administration's case for war. And you do see some news organizations picking up on that and saying, well, yes, Trump is he's dangerous, but on this issue, it's about our national security.
I mean, the media obviously is extremely critical of Trump on a number of issues. And I think you should be critical of those in power, holding those in power accountable. The reason they've found their backbone is because he's directly attacking them, and he has from the beginning of his presidency. The media is the enemy of the American people, he keeps intoning, and he names the news organizations, he names journalists, and he targets them. And so they're standing up, as they should. Except when it comes to foreign policy. When President Trump bombed Syria, you had the network CNN and MSNBC. When he dropped that Moab, the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan that was developed by Bush, that was not dropped by Bush or Obama. Within a few weeks, President Trump is dropping this in Afghanistan with no clear reason why. And you have both Brian Williams on MSNBC and Fareed Zakaria on CNN in these cases saying that's when he became president.
I think Donald Trump became President of the United States. I think this was actually a big moment.
We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two U.S. Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons.
They cannot diverge from the president, even as they try to protect themselves from him attacking them.
Well, and I would add another issue to that, the issue of the targeting of journalists and journalistic sources. I mean, it was like a national scandal when Jim Acosta had his valuable press pass taken away for, some days. And it was just not drumbeat coverage of this on CNN. And yet you have had record numbers of prosecutions now of journalistic sources, beginning with Reality Winner. This administration has gone after The Intercept. And you have Daniel Hale, the alleged drone whistleblower, facing 50 years in prison. Julian Assange, 18 criminal counts alleging espionage, could spend more than a century and a half in prison if he ends up being extradited to the United States. And you see no solidarity there. If Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers today, many, many news organizations, journalists, media figures, politicians would all be talking about the crime that he committed, and he needs to pay the price for what he's done. And yes, I understand this, but there are official channels to go through. I mean, it's remarkable. I don't care how many movies Tom Hanks is in about the Pentagon Papers. The fact of the matter remains that largely in this country, there is absolutely no journalistic solidarity when it's happening in real time.
It is a critical issue that there is press solidarity. I mean, that makes the difference, because how do people learn about the world if they don't know something personally about a country or about a person? They learn about it through the media, and that's why it's so critical. It can't just happen once. It's the drumbeat front page coverage that matters. And in this case, this matters enormously. Whether it's Julian Assange or whether it's Chelsea Manning, who remains in jail. I mean, we're talking about a whistleblower, we're talking about a publisher, and everyone has to take a stand, because it isn't even only about them. It's about everyone. The media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society. The media releasing information is about people's right to know. When the media releases information, people can When they know something, do something about it. And that's why it's so critical. Yes, it is absolutely critical the media not act as a conveyor belt for the lies of an administration. The lies so often take lives, but exposés mean that people live.
I think it's important to remind people that under both Clinton and Bush, you had fabrication of so-called evidence to either go to war or to justify war crimes. I'm thinking specifically in 1999 during the bombing of Yugoslavia, the so-called Kosovo War, there was an incident where the United States bombed a passenger train. And the video that was presented at the NATO press conference appeared to show that it was a split-second decision, that the missiles were released and blew up this train, but it was fog of war, and it happened instantly, that it was the United States doesn't target civilians. This was an accident, essentially.
As the pilot stared intently at the desired aim point on the bridge and worked it and worked it and worked it, and all of a sudden, at the very last instant, with less than a second to go, he caught a flash of movement that came into the screen, and it was the train coming in. And unfortunately, he couldn't dump the bomb at that point. It was locked, it was going into the target, and it was an unfortunate incident which he and the crew and all of us very much regret.
And CNN broadcast it, and it was all over the world. And it turns out that they had played that video at multiple times the speed to justify the bombing of a passenger train in Serbia. But then under Bush, you had the creation of what was called the Office of Special Plans in Rumsfeld's Pentagon, run by Stephen Cambone. And what were the special plans? Well, the special plans were to pluck, cherry-pick intelligence reports, present that as solid U.S. intelligence, even if they hadn't been verified, raw intelligence reports, and use that to circumvent the people that Cheney and Rumsfeld viewed as the liberals in the CIA to make their case for war. But it's so important right now to remember that history as you watch the present unfold.
That's right. I mean, when you talk about Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Bush, and you talk about the rollout to war in Iraq, remember Andrew Card, who was the former GM executive lobbyist who was the chief of staff of President Bush.
He was the guy who came in and whispered in Bush's ear on 9/11 when he was reading My Pet Coat.
That's right. That's right, in Florida. Well, in 2002, he was the one in the summer of 2002 when they're beginning to build up the push for war. And people said, why aren't you pushing harder? He said, you don't roll out a new product in August. And then they started to roll it out. Remember when Cheney told the New York Times weapons of mass destruction, then he goes on the Sunday talk shows and he says, don't believe me, look, and he holds up the New York Times.
There's a story in the New York Times this morning. This is, and I want to attribute to the Times. I don't want to talk about, obviously, specific intelligence sources, but it's now public that, in fact, he has been seeking to acquire, and we have been able to intercept and prevent him from acquiring through this particular channel, the kinds of tubes that are necessary to build a centrifuge. And the centrifuge is required to take low-grade uranium and enhance it into highly enriched uranium, which is what you have to have in order to build a bomb.
And you've got that feedback loop between all of them, and they're all repeating the same thing. I mean, this was just a build-up to war that ultimately led to those attacks in March of 2003. Even when you had people all over the world, millions of people, rocking the globe for peace. And we are now seeing the same thing. Any one little argument Pompeo or Bolton make, they don't care if you believe that. It's just the daily repetition, the feeling people have, well, maybe there is some kind of threat out there.